In a multiple slaying at a sorority house, a single bite mark is the only evidence. Can detectives use it to build a case against the most notorious serial killer of all time? Investigators hunt for a sexual sadist in a Canadian resort town. He leaves behind a trail of victims, but few clues. Can they stop him before he strikes again? Someone's murdering men on Florida's highways. A bloody palm print suggests a woman's touch. But who is she? What prompts some intelligent people to become cunning killing machines? As forensics tries to break their chain of death, psychologists seek to understand serial killers' fatal compulsion. On a February night in Pensacola, Florida in 1978, police officer David Lee saw an orange Volkswagen leaving the parking lot of a closed restaurant. Because the car had no reason to be there, he ran a check on the tags. He discovered it was stolen. The driver tried to flee the scene. After a chase and a struggle, he was apprehended. Police found stolen credit cards and several fake IDs in the car. The driver was taken in for questioning. The man flashed a student ID, but police determined that it too was stolen. After 2 days in custody, he finally decided to tell police his real name, Theodore Robert Bundy. At first, the Pensacola police had no reaction. They had no idea who Ted Bundy was. But they'd soon find out that his name had just been added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He was suspected of killing 36 young women in at least 4 western states. His lackluster arrest in Florida was the beginning of the end for the most notorious serial killer in history, who may have murdered over 40 women in 16 years. Ultimately, forensics would tie him to his crimes. In the process, the study of his murders would help spawn a whole new field of forensic psychology, a science that tries to understand how serial killers are created and what we can do to stop them. William Hagmeyer of the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit in Quantico, Virginia, interviewed Bundy in prison.
He was probably the most efficient killing machine that we've seen amongst the serial murderers that we've studied. With his ability to articulate how he made certain choices, why he let certain people live and die, he's become a standard by which other serial killers are measured.
So enormous were Bundy's crimes that they defied traditional crime-solving tactics. It wasn't until after he was caught that the pieces began to come together. Bundy didn't know that Florida would be the last stop on his trail of death. He arrived on January 7th, 1978, after escaping from a Colorado prison where he was awaiting trial for murder. He rolled into Tallahassee and moved into a boarding house called the Oaks, near Florida State University. It's now a fraternity house. Bundy didn't kill randomly. He was methodical, selecting college-age women with dark, straight hair parted in the middle. His proximity to campus provided ample quarry. Within a week of his arrival, he resumed his deadly rampage. At the Chi Omega house, sorority sister Nita Neary returned from a date around 3 a.m. on January 15, 1978. The lock to the back door had been broken for weeks. As she entered the house, she heard a commotion upstairs, someone running. She stopped as she saw a man run down the steps and disappear into the night. Then she realized someone was hurt. At 3:15 a.m., the campus police answered a frantic and garbled call for help from the sorority house. Bill Taylor was one of the first officers to respond.
We had stopped and broke up a fight between two of our fraternities, and we were just clearing that call when we got a call that two girls were in a fight at the Chi Omega house at 661 West Jefferson Street.
The campus police thought this was just another routine call. But nothing could prepare them for what they found. The house mother told the officers two women had been attacked. After calling paramedics, police investigated the rest of the house. An officer found Margaret Bowman in her bed. She'd been bludgeoned, then choked to death with a stocking. Down the hall lay another woman. Like Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy had been sexually assaulted, then beaten. In his fury, the killer had left bite marks in her flesh. She died en route to the hospital. While paramedics tended to the injured, police tried to make sense of the scene. Officer Taylor had never witnessed anything so brutal.
You're thinking all kinds of different things when you're going through there, and just how in the world could somebody do what was done to those victims in that manner while they slept in their beds?
The women never saw their attacker. But Nita Neary, who escaped a similar fate by mere seconds, described him. He was of medium height, wearing a navy pea coat and a knit cap. He carried a club. The sketchy description provided little help. The killer left behind no evidence, not even a fingerprint. At Florida State University, almost every man became a suspect. Every woman lived in terror.
We knew we were looking for a white male. We knew we were looking for someone who was around 5'8", 5'10". We knew that he had a dark-colored kind of peacoat kind of jacket on with a one of those navy blue watch caps on. You were looking at everybody that was walking, or everybody that you could see. Did he match that? Where could he be now? You know, is he hurting somebody else now? You get that horrible feeling that there's more, that something else is going to happen. Are there other crime scenes? Are there other people that are injured, other people hurt that we don't know about yet?
By then, Bundy had already moved 100 miles west to Lake City, Florida. There, he changed his tack and pursued a different kind of prey.
Yeah, he's just in the back there, yeah.
He lured 12-year-old Kimberly Leach into his van.
Yeah, he's right in the back.
They drove off. Leach would be Bundy's last victim. After ditching the stolen van and killing the girl, he stole a Volkswagen. He was partial to them because the passenger seat could be removed to accommodate his victims. But before he could strike again, he was picked up by Pensacola police for driving a stolen vehicle. Bundy's past was catching up with him, courtesy of the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Florida police were almost certain he was responsible for the Chi Omega murders, but they had to gather evidence to prove it.
Or 7 if this is a bicuspid to
The
right.
only clues
But,
collected at the Chi Omega
certainly
murders
then you have
were the
a
bite marks on the
this
body
one
of
shows
Lisa
it really
Levy.
well, because the lateral
Investigators
to the right
hoped
is definitely
they would be
behind
enough.
sepals, and it's high in the arch.
The task of
bite was
analyzing
also
them
made
fell on
from,
forensic
the
odontologist
first
Richard
bite anyway
Souveron.
was made harder. When Bundy was arrested, and the bite mark evidence was not considered a high priority. But when the detectives in the case were unable to come up with anything else, such as blood, fingerprints, hair, fiber, anything like that, then they decided, well, we'll give this a try.
At the time, bite mark evidence had not been used in Florida courts, but investigators had no alternative. Fortunately, one of the bites left a deep impression. Dr. Souveran saw that the killer's teeth had distinctive characteristics. They were crooked, chipped in several places, and had an unusual configuration. But he needed an impression of Bundy's teeth to make a match. That required a search warrant based on probable cause that Bundy's teeth were similar to the killer's. A snapshot of Bundy showing his teeth convinced a judge to sign the warrant. Souveran could now take the impression of Bundy's teeth. From the impression, Souveran made casts. It was apparent that Bundy's teeth were very unusual.
Bundy's teeth are unique. I've never seen a set of teeth like Bundy's, and indeed, no one in the world has a set of teeth like Bundy's. Turned and bit a second time, and here's the lateral incisor.
Most striking were Bundy's lower teeth, which showed an unusual pattern of wear, along with a distinct layout. The top teeth were chipped.
Both sides, and the teeth fit.
Using acetate overlays of Bundy's bite pattern, Souveran was able to conclude that only Ted Bundy's teeth could have left the bite marks found on the body of Lisa Levy.
Drop in.
Especially with that eccentric bite of his, that's pretty compelling.
Based in large part on this forensic evidence, a Florida grand jury indicted Bundy on July 27, 1978, for the 2 Chi Omega murders. His indictment was read on live television.
Let's go.
Theodore Robert Bundy, you are charged, indictment, 2 counts burglary and 2 counts murder in the first degree, 3 counts attempted murder in the first degree.
My chance to talk to the press.
Contrary to section 78204 Florida statute.
I'll plead not guilty right now.
And your grand jurors.
Bundy, always wanting to be in control, enjoyed the attention and turned his trial into a media circus.
Well, listen, I've been kept in isolation for 6 months. I've been kept away from the press. I've been buried by you. You've been talking for 6 months. I think it's my turn now. All right?
We got a court order that there won't be any press interviews.
Sure there won't be any press interviews. You've given them out. I'm gagged, you're not.
Okay. The Captain Roger will read your
I'll
right.
be heard.
Emphatically denying his guilt, acting as his own attorney, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders, as well as the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach.
Ted Bundy was caught in large part because he was a terrible driver, and an alert police officer in Pensacola picked him up. He was convicted in large part because of forensic odontology. He rarely left any forensic evidence at his crime scenes because he knew what the police were looking for. He didn't know that the science of forensic odontology advanced to the point where a forensic odontologist can testify with tremendous accuracy that bite marks on a victim, as with Ted Bundy, matched Ted Bundy's teeth. He didn't know that.
As Bundy sat on Florida's death row, he began to trade information in order to postpone his execution date. He confessed to a string of murders throughout the West and provided details about how he committed them. He painted a graphic picture of the evolution and slow deterioration of a serial killer.
To become a serial killer is to become a serial tennis player, a serial jogger. When you get away from it for a while, you start getting the itch to get back. He said the itch was getting tremendous. The clock was ticking.
Experts suspect Bundy may have started killing in 1962, at age 15. Then, beginning in 1974, he killed 8 college women in and around Seattle. On crutches, or with his arm in a sling, he used his seductive charm to lure his victims. In this way, he snared 6 women in 6 months.
Ted Bundy felt that this victim had a choice. She didn't have to come with me. And as he said on many occasions, I wasn't a caveman killer. I didn't go and drag them out. They came to me.
Emboldened by his success, he sought more risky prey during a crowded weekend at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle. 2 of the women at the lake that day, 23-year-old Janice Ott and 18-year-old Denise Noslin, apparently left with the injured stranger 4 hours apart. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. Based on eyewitness descriptions, police artists made a composite sketch of the slender young man with a Canadian accent who called himself Ted. Part of Bundy's success was his cunning. Part was his looks and outward behavior. No one could have suspected his homicidal inclinations. Seattle writer Ann Rule has made a career studying killers and their victims. In 1975, when she was just starting out, she was hired to write a book about the Seattle killer. Little did she realize that he would turn out to be someone she knew.
And I thought, gee, that looks like Ted Bundy. And I know that Ted sometimes affects a Canadian dialect. I knew that he lived in a boarding house on the same street where 2 victims had been found. But they were looking for people with a criminal record. And Ted Bundy, the only thing they had him for, 2 citations for bravery, for helping citizens. He'd been assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Council, worked for the governor of Washington. Not the kind of guy you're going to focus on.
Anne had met Bundy in 1971, 4 years earlier, when she volunteered at a crisis clinic in Seattle.
I was a civilian volunteer, and they would always pair us with a work-study student. And just through the luck of the draw, my partner was this very nice young man who was then about 23, named Theodore Bundy. So I spent 2 nights a week for a year, locked up alone all night long with Ted Bundy.
The weekend following the abductions, the beaches at Lake Sammamish were strangely empty. Over the next several months, bodies of women who disappeared began turning up in the nearby hills. Police in Washington intensified their search for the killer. 12 women had gone missing in the Seattle area, all suspected to be victims of the mysterious Ted. But Bundy was smart enough to know when to move on. In September 1974, he made his way to Salt Lake City. Over the next month and a half, 3 teenage girls disappeared without a trace. Then, on November 8th, Bundy spotted 23-year-old Carol Duranch. Posing as a police detective, he approached her and told her that someone had been caught stealing something from her car. He asked her to look inside to see if anything was missing. She told him everything seemed to be there, but Bundy asked her to accompany him to police headquarters to see if she could ID the thief anyway. Though Duranch was skeptical, she did as he asked. But as soon as she got into his Volkswagen, the trap was sprung. He handcuffed her and threatened to kill her on the spot. But she managed to get the car door open. She broke free. Duranch was the only woman that we know for sure to escape the clutches of Ted Bundy. But Bundy was unfazed. Over the next several months, more women would die. In Utah, Bundy was finally caught on a traffic infraction. Carol Duranch picked him out of a lineup. He was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years. He was then extradited to Colorado, where, based on hair samples found in his car, he was charged with the murder of a young woman. And there, through a small hole in the ceiling of his prison cell, he escaped to kill again. 8 days before the Chi Omega murders, Ted Bundy fled Colorado and headed to Florida. A friend loaned him money to live on. He'd been incarcerated over a year, and his fatal compulsion grew all the while.
This need to fill the addiction had grown so strong because he'd been in prison and unable to kill, but sitting there fueling his fantasies, thinking about it. And when he was out, he had no control over it.
Bundy was now taking chances, making mistakes. Gone was the kindly stranger ploy. At the Chi Omega house, he attacked with violence and rage and left behind the clue that led to his conviction. Bill Hagmeyer believes that Bundy's recklessness was inevitable. Serial killers become more daring and less predictable over time.
Many serial killers, in fact, all that I've dealt with, their crimes start out as personal agendas, so to speak. The first victim may be an accident, it may be a displaced aggression, but after that, it becomes predatory.
Once he was in prison, Bundy provided the ultimate case study in serial killings. Hagmeyer set to work trying to understand where a killer's fatal compulsion stems from. Bundy himself helped interview other serial killers on death row to find a common denominator. The answer isn't clear-cut. In background and behavior, serial killers are just like the rest of us.
Serial killers come from different backgrounds. There is no consistent factor that I'm aware of in all their development. Basically, if one were to look at Ted Bundy's evolution as a human being, they would be shocked that he became a serial killer because he didn't act any differently, didn't appear to be maturing any differently than other children around him.
Writer Ann Rule believes that killers like Bundy are born and bred.
I think to create a serial killer or any sadistic sociopath, you have to have a combination of a genetic predisposition toward violence. Just like some people can play the violin, some people can tap dance, but these people have a tendency toward violence. Now, if that child is born into a loving home where he feels safe or she feels safe, we'll never know. But if you have the terrible synchronicity of the genetic predisposition and an abusive home, then you have the perfect soil to grow one of these people.
Bundy showed his homicidal tendencies as a young child of 3. His Aunt Julia, who was then a teenager, awoke to find Ted slipping butcher knives into her bed.
But as with most serial killers, it came down to a matter of choices. We're all a product of our environment, our genetics, our experiences, and what we become in life, whether it's a career choice, making a choice of a mate, or our avocation, and his just happened to be murder, we're accountable for that.
Bundy discovered in his early 20s that he was illegitimate. He aspired to a higher station than his stepfather could afford, becoming active in local politics. But rejection by a college girl of breeding and refinement may have filled him with smoldering rage. When he began killing less than a year later, all of his victims would bear a resemblance to the girl who'd rejected him. As Agent Hagmeyer spent more time with him, Bundy began to call him his best friend. Bundy shared what it's like to be a serial killer.
He said, when you're alone with a victim who's very much alive and vibrant and pleading for their life, he said, you become God. He said, you have the power over life and death. And he said, when you kill them, you hear the last noises that they'll ever put out of their mouth. You can basically taste the last breath that comes out of their body. And he said, there's a phenomenal feeling of power over that. And he said, that's what you feed off of after a while.
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, I mean, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible.
Bundy was convicted of killing 3 women and confessed to killing more than 30 others. Police will never know if that was a boast or a conservative estimate. He received his final punishment on January 24th, 1989, in Florida's electric chair. Hungry for that sense of godlike power, serial killers feel compelled to murder. But they don't always kill their victims. Sometimes they marry them. On June 29, 1991, 2 canoeists were spending a lazy afternoon on Lake Gibson near Niagara Falls, Canada. The waters had receded, revealing several blocks of concrete speckled with black paint. When one of the men stepped on a block, it broke in 2. He was horrified at what he saw. Inside were the severed limbs of a human body. Police found body parts in each of the 8 blocks. It took 2 weeks to obtain the dental records to identify the victim. She was a teenage girl named Leslie Mahaffey, who disappeared 2 weeks earlier from the nearby city of Burlington. Whoever killed her had also sexually abused her. It was a shocking crime in a country unused to violence. Placed in charge of the investigation was Vince Bevan of the Niagara Regional Police.
Once we knew who the victim was, we had, almost a month's lag time in there, so we had to go back and start to retrace to find out, who she was with, what the circumstances were of her disappearance, and start to work back from the city of Burlington to see if we could find any clues that would point us in the right direction about how she met her death and ultimately wound up in the concrete in Lake Gibson.
But there were no witnesses and no clues to the killer's identity. Forensic scientist Mike Kershaw began by looking at the concrete blocks, gingerly sifting through the rubble, hoping to find some piece of helpful evidence.
I examined approximately 700 pounds of concrete, and just the examination using the light sources I spent probably close to 120 hours on. Some of the things we were hoping to find included items that might have come from Leslie Mahaffey, like jewelry. We were also looking for evidence such as saws or saw blades. But what I've been finding is hair, fiber, hair that doesn't look or looks foreign to the concrete itself or foreign to Leslie Mahaffey.
Chemical analysis determined that the concrete was a ready-mix brand so common it was impossible to trace. The paint was a black spray paint. The trace evidence consisted of hair that matched the victim and several strands of different light-colored hair. Kershaw had nothing to compare it with. The forensic evidence was not adding up to much. The search for the Niagara killer took on a new urgency when another young girl named Kristen French was reported missing. She left her school on April 16th and was last seen walking past a church. She never arrived home. 2 weeks after Kristen French disappeared, a scrap collector discovered her body. She'd been sexually abused and killed in much the same fashion as Mahaffey. For Vince Bevan, it was now clear a serial killer was at work, and his increasing boldness was cause for alarm. Kristen French had been abducted at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a parking lot near a busy street.
For somebody to abduct her from that particular area, it's unusual because of the high level of risk that offender would have taken. I mean, there are any number of things that could have happened to interfere with what his plan was. And it's not a desperate act by any means. but it is certainly an above normal level of risk for an offender of this type.
The first break in the case came from 75 miles away in the town of Scarborough. For 2 years, police there worked unsuccessfully to catch a serial rapist. Acting on a tip, in 1990 they'd visited Paul Bernardo, an accountant who resembled the man described by some of the victims. He seemed an unlikely suspect.
When you think of somebody who could be responsible for crimes like this, you expect them to be marked in some way, like a hunchback dragging one leg behind him.
As a matter of procedure, police collected blood and saliva samples from Bernardo for DNA testing. He was one of 1,500 potential suspects, and in these early days of DNA testing, the process was time-consuming. It took an overworked Canadian forensics lab 2 years to complete their analysis of Bernardo's DNA. Meantime, Bernardo moved from Scarborough to Niagara in 1991. The serial rapes in Scarborough had suddenly stopped. The killings in Niagara had begun. When the DNA results came back in February 1993, they proved Bernardo was the Scarborough rapist. Scarborough authorities notified Niagara police.
We could have had an opportunity to connect those offenses earlier in the investigation. But as it was, that connection wasn't made until the DNA probe came back with Bernardo.
Bernardo was arrested for the rapes in Scarborough and the murders in Niagara. He denied the murder charges, and police had no sure way to connect him to the killings. If Bevan wanted a conviction, he needed tangible proof. He obtained a warrant to search Bernardo's house. A search team spent 10 weeks looking for hair, blood, fingerprints, any physical evidence showing the presence of the murder victims.
They got on their hands and knees with a stereo microscope and searched tuft by tuft until they started to find hair, and they actually found small clippings of hair that were unique to Kristen French.
Along with the hair, police found traces of DNA from French and Mahaffey. Autopsies revealed that both victims had been drugged. In a desk drawer, investigators found a tranquilizer that Bernardo's wife, Carla Homolka, had obtained from the veterinarian's office where she worked. On a videotape Bernardo made for insurance purposes, police found an inventory of his basement. More clues came into focus. First was a circular saw, one that matched the type police thought he may have used to dismember his first victim. The next clue on the tape was equally incriminating.
And as he panned across the basement floor, showing some of the tools that he had, he went past an open cupboard. And in the top shelf of this cupboard were 2 cans of spray paint. One had a gray lid, one had a black lid. When we went in and executed the search warrant, and during our search, we were unable to find that black can of spray paint.
Besides the evidence on the tape, investigators noticed gouges on the stairs to his basement. Microscopic examination revealed black paint marks. Forensics experts created concrete blocks similar in size to the ones that contained Mahaffey's body. They spray painted the blocks and pushed them up a similar flight of stairs. The marks they made matched those on Bernardo's stairs. The forensic evidence was piling up, but it was all circumstantial. The case was clinched with the help of a surprising eyewitness. In January 1993, Paul Bernardo's wife, Carla Homolka, left him. She would later tell police that Bernardo had tied her and forced her to act out the last moments of his victims' lives. Fearing she would suffer their fate, she fled. In February, as evidence was mounting against Bernardo, she decided to make a deal and confessed that she herself had played a role in the heinous crimes of Paul Bernardo, crimes that he had videotaped. Carla Homolka had met Paul Bernardo in 1987 when she was still a teenager. Bernardo was a handsome, apparently successful young man 6 years older than she was. But beneath his pleasant exterior, Bernardo was possessed by a desire to subjugate women. Roy Hazelwood, a former FBI agent and an expert on sex-related crimes, has spent 6 years studying the strange bond between serial killers and the women who fall in love with them. Canadian prosecutors called on him to assess Carla's state of mind. Hazelwood believes Bernardo, like many serial killers, saw women as lesser creatures that didn't deserve respectability.
That explains why they go for nice middle-class women rather than prostitutes or alcoholics or drug abusers, because they want to tear down that image of niceness and purity, if you will, that surrounds a nice middle-class person.
As a teenager, he began spying on women in the dark. They became objects that existed only for his pleasure. According to Hazelwood, Bernardo saw his future wife, Carla Homolka, as a woman he knew he could dominate, forcing her to his will.
These men have an innate ability to identify women who are vulnerable, women who are naive, women who have few life experiences or low self-esteem, or they have, as I mentioned earlier, dependent personalities where they crave and need the attention of others and the approval of others.
Carla's parents encouraged her romance with the handsome, upscale Bernardo. By 1990, he already had her under a horrible spell. On Christmas Eve, she helped him drug her own sister, Tammy, so he could have sex with her. But the drug had induced her death instead. They said she drank too much alcohol. No one suspected the truth.
There's no question that Bernardo had manipulated her. She was an attractive, intelligent young woman. Why she ever became involved in the first incident is sort of a mystery to me. But I think it's quite clear that after her sister's death, she was trapped. She had trapped herself, in essence, in a situation that he could take advantage of.
On the night of June 14, 1991, 6 months after Tammy's death, Bernardo went out to stalk young women. According to what he told Carla, he saw Leslie Mahaffey locked out of her house at 2 a.m. He offered his assistance, then lured the girl to his car with the offer of a cigarette. Carla told police Paul had forced her to videotape his sexual assaults on Mahaffey. Paul and Carla were married 2 weeks later. The day police discovered the body sealed in concrete. Over time, Bernardo had tightened his grasp on Carla, drawing her deeper into his crimes.
Because she's in love with him, and because she wants his approval, and because she wants to please him, she agrees to participate, and eventually it becomes more and more bizarre.
Carla helped her husband kidnap Kristen French in April 1992. She'd pretended to need directions, asking the girl to show them where they were on a map. Bernardo sneaked up behind her and shoved her into the car. Once again, according to Homolka, she had participated in and recorded Bernardo's sexual assaults on video. But where were the tapes? Despite 10 weeks of searching every corner and crevice of Bernardo's house, Canadian police were unable to find them. They'd discover later that Bernardo, in jail, had his lawyer remove them. When the tapes were finally turned over to the police, they validated every shocking detail of what Carla had said. Bernardo used the tapes to experience his crimes again and again. The videotapes, along with Carla Homolka's testimony, were more than enough to convict Paul Bernardo. He was sentenced to life in prison, no chance of parole. For her part in the crimes, Karla Homolka was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a sentence based on her testimony prior to finding the videotapes. But the tapes clearly showed Karla participating in the torture and sexual abuse of the victims. Was Karla truly a victim herself, or a savvy accomplice who worked out a sweet deal with the police?
Is she a victim? Not in the sense that she's not responsible for what she did. She certainly is responsible for what she did. And she needs to be punished for her activities in which she acted in concert in the abduction and or murder of 3 different people. So in that sense, no, she's not a victim. Is she a victim in the sense that she came under his spell? Is she a victim in the sense that he abused her? In that sense, yes, she's a victim in that sense.
From the first of Paul Bernardo's rapes to the day of his capture, almost 6 years had gone by. According to Ann Rule, if he hadn't been caught, he would have continued to kill.
They start maybe 2 or 3 years apart, and then it's 1 a year, and then it's 1 a month, and then it's 1 a week, until toward the end they need more and more of the substance that they crave to make them feel normal. And in the case of serial killers, it's murder. First they do it to get a high, and then after that they seem to need it. And they're almost all caught because they begin to take chances in the end.
Slowly, painfully, experts are learning the warped rules of the sexual serial killer. But do the same rules apply when the killer is a woman? In December 1989, along a Florida highway outside of Daytona Beach, officers found an abandoned car registered to a Tampa man named Richard Mallory. He had been missing for several days. Another week and a half went by before the 51-year-old Mallory turned up, naked, shot several times with a .22 caliber pistol, and abandoned 2 miles from where his vehicle was found. Police sealed off the area to search for clues. Investigator Larry Horzepa of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office led the investigation.
At the time, we weren't exactly sure what we had, so as in all of our homicide investigations that we did an entire sweep of the area and basically collected up everything that we could possibly find that we thought may be connected with the crime.
But investigators found very little evidence pointing to the killer. The investigation was stymied by lack of clues. As Volusia police worked on the case, police in 3 other counties struggled with murders of their own. Immersed in their local crime scenes, they had no knowledge of the other killings, no idea they were connected.
We didn't know about the other killings that had been occurring for almost a year. Basically, we were operating solely on ours.
As the body count climbed, police became aware that a deadly pattern was developing throughout Florida. Finally, the separate police departments pooled their resources.
We found the similarities in the fact that all the men were older men, being over the ages of 45 years of age, that they were basically all traveling alone, that they were traveling the major highways. We found that the bodies, all of them were discarded close to a major highway, and the fact that the vehicles that they had were placed somewhere else.
The killer had been methodical, consistent. All but one of the victims had been shot in the torso with a .22 caliber pistol, a relatively small firearm. In every case, the driver's seat was pulled up close to the steering wheel. The evidence suggested the killer was a short person, possibly a woman. If this were true, it was one for the books. There'd never been a female serial killer, or at least not one that police knew of. But at this point, it was just a guess. The killer had been thorough, wiping off all fingerprints. Then, on July 4th, 1990, a woman reported to police that she saw a car crash through a fence, then drive off. In the car were two women, a blonde and a shorter brunette. A few miles away, a car matching the description was found abandoned. Witnesses at this scene also described the two women. The car's registration revealed that it belonged to Peter Sims, age 65, an itinerant missionary who'd been missing for almost a month. Police saw a possible connection to the string of homicides. The car was turned over to Merv Stevens of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
The vehicle had been basically wiped down on the inside and outside. The crime scene analysts had went to the armrest on the driver's side of the car and had removed the armrest. Upon removing that armrest, they noticed what it looked to appear to be a palm print, a bloody palm print.
The single print was their only clue, and a potentially damning one. But prints in blood are notoriously fragile. Forensics would have only one chance to read the imprint. Only one chance to link killer with crime scene. They could not afford to make a mistake.
I think they made the latent lift as a last resort. Once they had discovered what they thought was a blood print, or looked to be like a blood print, it was reddish brown in color. And in photographing it and using the different lighting techniques, a blood print will tend to dry out. Once a blood print dries out, it becomes real fragile. And simple moving it around, handling that type of item, the print will basically deteriorate and it will fall to pieces.
After the print was photographed, clear tape was carefully placed over it. With even greater care, the tape was slowly lifted. Any little bend in the tape would crack the print and compromise the lift. Once the print adhered to the tape, it was affixed to a white card. The technicians were home free. The lift was a success. They analyzed the palm print and compared it to those of known criminals in the state of Florida. Stevens found a match in a woman named Lori Grody. She'd been convicted on a weapons charge. Grody was also known as Cammie Green and Eileen Warnes. Because several of the missing automobiles had been burglarized, police began checking pawn shops in the hopes of finding the stolen goods. At one, they found a pawn ticket in the name of Cammie Green for a particular brand of camera and a radar detector, items missing from the car of murder victim Richard Mallory. Florida requires pawn shops to take fingerprints. Cammie Green's print from the pawn ticket was compared to the prints in Stevens' files. The prints matched. The bloody palm print and stolen items were now linked to a single person, a woman named Eileen Warnes. Investigators traced Warnes to Daytona Beach, where she was a part of the biker crowd. She hung out at a bar called the Last Resort, where she slept on these benches behind the bar. Undercover police kept her under constant surveillance until they could collect more evidence of her crimes. But when they learned that a statewide biker barbecue was scheduled for the next weekend, they were afraid they'd lose Warnes in the crowd. On January 9, 1991, police made their move and arrested her. A key found in her possession led police to a locker filled with items stolen from the murder victims. The case against Warnes grew stronger. Next, they pressured her friends for more information. To keep them out of it, Warnes confessed.
I shot him, and then I thought to myself, well, all I know is just keep on shooting. Because I gotta kill the guy. He's going to go and tell somebody.
When she was convicted in Florida for the murder of 6 men, Warnes had the distinction of being one of the first female serial killers, deadly as the male. But why, beginning in December of 1989, had she become a killer, hitching rides with middle-aged men, suggesting sex for money in a secluded spot, then shooting them to death? Warnes claimed she'd acted in self-defense. It was a claim Larry Horzepa found difficult to believe.
I think as she was applying her trade, as she was going along, for whatever reason, whether she needed more money or whether she decided that this would just be easy pickings, at one point in her life, starting with Mr. Mallory, she decided to bring a firearm into play. And once she went ahead and fired that first shot and killed that first man, felt it was easy. And why not do it again?
Ann Rule has studied women who kill. She disagrees that robbery was the motive. She believes Eileen Warnes felt abused by the men in her life, and the killing was her attempt at retaliation. Her anger was typical of serial killers.
But of all the women that I have ever studied, she is the only one who seems to have a particular victim type, who has a particular MO, who's killing stranger to stranger, and fits into the serial murder pattern.
For Ann Rule, the most chilling aspect of serial killers is their lack of remorse for their crimes.
These people believe that they deserve to have anything they want that makes them feel better. It doesn't matter who gets hurt as long as they're happy, because they are real and the rest of us are paper doll characters. We don't feel the way they do.
With each murder, serial killers lose a little more of their conscience, making the next killing that much easier. As police departments throughout the country begin to share information, they can more quickly see the deadly patterns emerge. Then they can stop serial killers in their tracks. The press calls him the Hillside Strangler, but he may be part of a deadly duo. With little to go on, investigators face an uphill struggle as women continue to die. California's state parks contain hundreds of trails, but only one trailside killer. When the crime scene is as big as all outdoors, how can detectives hope to find him? A Midwestern highway is littered with the bodies of young men. Authorities know the identity of the interstate killer, but can they prove it before he kills again? Spurred on by the thrill of the kill, a serial murderer can't stop on his own. The longer it takes to catch him, the bigger the body count. They started on Halloween 1977. In the foothills just north of Los Angeles, the morning light brought a resident of a quiet suburban neighborhood a glimpse of horror. Sprawled in his front yard was a naked woman. She was dead. Not wanting his children to see the body, he covered her with a tarp. Detective Frank Salerno was one of the first inspectors to arrive.
When I initially got the call, I was told that it may be an overdose. It was as soon as I saw the body, it appeared to me without a doubt that it was a murder, not a drug overdose of any type.
There were ligature marks around her neck, wrists, and ankles, indicating that the woman had been tied up and strangled to death. She had also been raped. Police had no idea who she was or where she had come from. The only possible clue found at the scene was a small piece of white fiber on the victim's eyelid. It wasn't much, but it was all authorities had to work with. But Detective Salerno noticed one more thing that would be crucial to their search. It was the way the body lay.
She looked like she'd been placed at the location. She didn't look like she had been tossed. It actually looked like maybe two people had carried her, maybe lifted her out of a trunk, lifted her from the bed of a pickup truck or something, and one had carried her from underneath her armpits and one had carried her from underneath her legs and placed her there. So it was just an overall impression that we may be dealing with two people.
Investigators assumed this brutal strangling and the killer's careless disposal of the body was an isolated incident, just another unfortunate murder in Los Angeles. But the Halloween murder was only the beginning. Less than a week later, a jogger happened upon the nude body of a woman lying in plain sight beside the jogging path. With the second body, a deadly pattern began to emerge. Both victims had been raped, strangled, and dumped out in the open for anyone to find. Both bodies were practically on display, disposed of on slight inclines or hills.
The only difference was that you had different bodies, but you had the same marks on the wrist in the same locations. You had the same marks on the ankles, almost to the inch of where they were on each body. You had the same mark on the throat, the same ligature mark. So at that point we knew that we had a single killer or killers that were at least responsible for two murders.
But the murders didn't stop there. The press, unaware that authorities were searching for two suspects, dubbed the killer the Hillside Strangler. On November 20th, a 9-year-old boy was playing near his house when he spied what he thought were two mannequins. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were not. Dolores Cepeda and Sonia Johnson had been missing for over a week before their bodies were found. They weren't even 15 years old. The crime fit the Strangler's pattern to a T, except in this instance, there was a witness. A boy had seen the girls on the day of their disappearance. Once they got off the bus, he noticed they stopped to talk to someone in a car. He didn't see the stranger's face, but remembered the car was a large sedan. The girls' principal also gave police some useful information. She knew the girls personally and insisted that with the ever-present scare of the Hillside Strangler, the girls would probably not have gone anywhere with a stranger, unless that stranger was masquerading as a policeman. Tension in the city and within the police force became palpable, and officers stepped up their efforts to find the killers, whoever they might be.
We were spending 7 days a week, 12, 15 hours a day working. That didn't slow down ever.
Police had only hunches and few clues about the Hillside Strangler. They weren't sure if they were looking for one man or two, or whether the killer was truly an officer or just posing. Only one thing was certain. With each passing night, more women would die. November 28th, the killers did not take Thanksgiving off. When Lauren Wagner's parents realized she hadn't come in from the night before, they panicked. Even more disturbing was the fact that her car was parked out front. Whatever happened to Lauren took place after she got home. officers canvassed the neighborhood looking for any lead that might point them to a suspect.
Have you heard anything, seen anything suspicious in the area?
One neighbor recalled seeing Lauren pull up around 9 p.m., followed by another car. Two men jumped out and started arguing with her. The witness told investigators they didn't look like police. Even so, Lauren got into the car with them and drove off. Her body was found the next day. In addition to the strangler's telltale markings, some small fibers were found on Wagner's body. They didn't match the fiber found on the first victim. After 9 brutal murders, it was only the second time any evidence was collected from a victim. Police continued to scour the streets, but with nothing more than a vague description of the suspect's car, there was not much to go on, and absolutely no way to match the fibers with the killer. The witness's report did, however, confirm the police's theory of 2 killers, and authorities now believe the men were merely posing as police. Six weeks later, the body of an 18-year-old prostitute turned up. This time, the killers were toying with police, like a cat with a mouse. They dumped the body on a hillside with City Hall as a backdrop.
But it just seemed like they were trying to give us a message that they were still operating. They were operating with impunity. They could do whatever they wanted when they wanted.
Police searched the apartment the prostitute had gone to that night and found fingerprints that they thought might belong to the killer, but they didn't come up with any matches in their databases. Then, as suddenly as the murders began, they stopped. With such little evidence to go on, there was not much detectives could do but sit and wait. After 4 months of terror in Los Angeles, an eerie calm fell over the city. The killers were still out there, but no one knew when or where the hillside stranglers would strike next.
We don't have quotas. You can write as many as you want.
In Bellingham, Washington, January 1979, a man reported that his girlfriend and her roommate were missing. He told police they were supposed to be house-sitting for an acquaintance who worked as a security guard.
We all know him pretty well. That's all I've got. Do you guys have enough?
Investigators went to the women's apartment. From the moment he arrived, Bellingham Police Chief Terry Mangan knew that Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick were in danger.
And it was evident as soon as we got there that something was terribly wrong, in the sense that they had left Diane Wilder's car there with some groceries in it, some of which needed to be refrigerated. The cat had not been fed or let out, and the lights were on.
In a situation like this, it's difficult to discern what might be a clue. Police collected what they could, including a business card for a security guard named Kenneth Bianchi, and a message in Diane Wilder's handwriting that said he'd called. Bianchi seemed like an obvious suspect, but when police interviewed him, he denied knowing the women or of any house-sitting arrangement. He told them that he was at a law enforcement class that night, training to become a member of the sheriff's reserves.
Scott, X30, you copy?
Hours later, police received the call they were dreading. A car had been discovered near a deserted construction site. Inside were 2 bodies, Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick. They had been strangled. Detectives determined that the murders most likely took place somewhere else, and whoever had left the bodies there had taken careful measures to clean up after himself. Authorities had trouble lifting fingerprints off the car. It had been wiped clean.
Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick, both of them Western Washington students.
Bellingham police criminalist Bob Knudsen processed the scene.
Leaving Fred Meyer's at about 7 o'clock. This was, in our opinion, Definitely not a first-time killer. This is somebody who had been there before.
But no matter how expert a killer is, chances are he'll leave a trace of himself behind. A single hair that did not belong to either of the women gave detectives some hope of linking the crime to a suspect. On one of the women's shoes and clothes were fuzzy gold fibers, most likely from a carpet. Locating the source might lead investigators to the murder site. Though finding a gold carpet would be no problem, the chances of finding the right one were slim. Detectives checked on an address found in the glove box. As the examination continued, authorities found something else. Stuck to the underside of the car were sprigs of fresh heather. Police brought the car to the lab to study the underside more closely. They found several fresh scrapes on the gas tank. Investigators speculated that when the killer threw the bodies into the car, the weight forced the back of the vehicle down onto a rock or something similar. The killer may have scraped the gas tank as he pulled away. A rock, a sprig of heather, and some gold carpet fibers. The perfect ingredients for a mystery. But how to solve it?
I have some update on the missing girls, the co-ed case. Control. We'll get the volunteers out.
The address in the glove box led to an empty, locked house with gold carpeting. To obtain a key, police contacted the security company that monitored it. It was the same security company that Kenneth Bianchi worked for. They told police that the key was missing from their file. While the paperwork allowing them to enter the house was being processed, investigators examined the grounds.
But there was some heather and bushes and things there, and Bob Knudsen pushed, as I recall, pushed the heather aside, he and Terry White, and there were scrapes, fresh scrapes on the rock under the heather, which subsequently matched the scrapes in the gas tank on the bottom of the car.
Yep, it's a good match. Now all we got to do now is finish photoing the rock, get it ready for court.
Inside the house, investigators found hair from 3 persons. 2 matched the victims. The 3rd matched the unknown hair also found in the automobile. The car, the 2 women, and a 3rd person had been at the house. And the only people who had access to the house while the owners were away were the employees of the security company. Once again, police turned to Kenneth Bianchi. Authorities obtained a warrant to search Bianchi's house for clues to the murder. What they found instead was a basement full of stolen goods. The stolen property was enough grounds to arrest Bianchi and hold him until police could gather evidence to link him to the murders. Investigators later learned that he never showed up at his law enforcement class on the night Wilder and Mandic disappeared. Police had no trouble finding him on patrol at his security job.
You have the right to remain silent.
Forensic specialists matched the foreign hairs found in the car and the house in Washington to Bianchi. Undoubtedly, he had been at these locations. Though confident that Bianchi would prove to be their man, investigators had no idea who they actually had on their hands. A California driver's license found in his possession prompted a call to the Los Angeles authorities to check on prior offenses. The detective that took the call was part of the Hillside Strangler task force and recognized the similarities.
Yeah, I'm sitting down.
It was the call Detective Frank Salerno had been waiting 2 long years to receive.
You're kidding me. Not only did he live next door and across street from 2 of our victims, but he had lived on Tamarind, which was the Kimberly Martin case. So right away, we've got a guy that's connected by location to 3 of the victims, and we never had that before.
hair found in his car in Washington State matched two of the hillside victims in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Bianchi's fingerprints also linked him to the murder of the prostitute. Faced with undeniable evidence, Bianchi confessed to the hillside stranglings and named his cousin, Angelo Bono, as his accomplice.
Well, we took all the evidence, which amounted to one tuft of fiber and one clump of fiber, and we served a search warrant on Angelo Bono's house and his trim shop.
A search of Bono's car upholstery shop brought an exact match of the white fibers found on two of the hillside victims.
When I pick her up, you get it.
The cousins explained how they found their targets, cruising the streets of Hollywood posing as undercover cops. Some of the victims were prostitutes who were easy to lure into the car. Others were simply stopped and arrested on bogus charges. Once a woman was in the car, she was handcuffed and taken to Bono's shop, where she'd be tied up, raped, and strangled to death. Then, it was just a matter of disposing of the body under cover of darkness.
Just stand
On the corner by yourself,
on the
just
corner
like that.
Yeah.
California, instead of Washington, are giving up the death penalty.
How does a defendant plead to count one of the information?
Guilty, Your Honor.
How does the defendant plead to count two of the information?
Guilty.
Bianchi pled guilty to 2 first-degree murders in Washington and confessed to 10 murders in California. He and Angelo Bono are currently serving multiple life terms without parole. Many consider big cities to be havens for violence and murder. But the truth is, there's no law that keeps serial killers within city limits. In October 1980, some hikers were enjoying the serene beauty of Mount Tamalpais State Park in Northern California when they made a gruesome discovery. The body of a young woman lay flat on the ground. She had been shot in the head and raped. Police arrived to process the scene. The victim was 26-year-old Ann Alderson. She'd gone to the park to meditate the day before and had not returned. Detective Rich Keaton of the Marin County Sheriff's Department led the investigation.
The park is almost like a sanctuary, and it has kind of a reverence in it, and overlooking San Francisco Bay. And to have such a violent crime occur in a pristine area was just out of the ordinary.
There was not much evidence at the scene. Traces of biological material found around the body and the bullets removed from the victim were sent to the crime lab in Santa Rosa with the hopes that they might point to a suspect. Forensic specialist Mike Waller set out to determine what type of weapon was used in the murder.
By evaluating the bullet under a stereo microscope such as what I have here, and by looking at the class characteristics and measuring them, we can get an idea of a potential model or make in some cases. And one weapon that was a possibility in this case turned out to be what is known as a Rossi .38 special revolver.
We've done the aerial photos.
Without a suspect or weapon, the identification provided no help. Investigators had no choice but to shelve the case until more information turned up. They didn't have long to wait. A month after the murder, detectives were searching for 2 missing women on the trails at Point Reyes National Seashore in Marin County. But they didn't find what they were looking for. Two bodies, a man and a woman, lay face down in the woods. They had been shot to death. Police surveyed the scene but were disappointed with their findings. They uncovered no footprints. There were no hairs or fibers, only the bullets. While officers finished processing the scene, police found the women they had been looking for. They too were dead. Both women were naked. They had been shot and raped. No fingerprints or other telltale clues were found.
My first impressions were that this was almost a shock that this wasn't really happening. We couldn't have 4 more bodies found in a park of young women and one young man who were simply executed for what appeared to be no other reason than sexual violation.
Investigators now had 5 murders and still only a handful of bullets as clues. By examining the barrel marks left on the bullets, Mike Waller confirmed authorities' worst fears. All the bullets recovered from the various scenes had been fired from the same gun. Now there was no question about it. A serial killer was stalking victims in the state parks. But detectives were no closer to finding who he was. Papers called the murderer the Trailside Killer. Detectives knew that a true serial killer wouldn't stop until he was caught, and catching him wouldn't be easy. The killer was cunning, the murders well planned. Police hoped that someone may have spied the killer before he made his kills. A task force collected accounts from people who had seen a strange man on the hiking trails earlier in the day. They put together a composite sketch from their descriptions. Investigators also assembled a profile of their suspect based on case histories of similar murderers. He would be a white male, 20 to 25, who was tall and thin, with black hair. He would be good-looking and charming, an outgoing guy with a winning personality. Once the sketch was approved by the task force, flyers were distributed throughout the county to alert the public. Warnings were posted at the state parks, and agents hiked the trails undercover. The FBI was brought in to assist with the investigation. Police were busy hatching an elaborate plan to stop the killer. They called it Code 555. The idea was to immediately shut down all roads leading out of the county the second the next attack was reported. It wouldn't prevent another murder, but it was the only way authorities could see to apprehend a suspect. And something had to be done. The community was frightened to death. The hiking trails became vacant. People quit coming to the parks. The suspect's face was posted everywhere in an effort to warn the people of Marin County. But police were ready. Code 555 could be deployed in a moment's notice. Next time the trailside killer struck, there would be no escape.
Bodies were found on the left-hand side of the mountain.
Like in some fairy tale, in the beautiful mountains of Northern California, there dwelled a monster. Though 4 months had passed without incident, investigators knew the trailside killer wasn't finished. In March of 1981, visitors to Henry Cowell State Park were taking a break at the observation deck when they heard screams. A terrified young man was limping up the trail toward them, yelling hysterically. He had been hiking with his girlfriend when a stranger approached and shot them both. His girlfriend was dead, and the killer was still loose in the park. the police arrived in minutes, but the murderer had slipped away undetected. Stephen Hartle was rushed to the hospital. Marin County Police had been ready for the trailside killer, prepared to shut down all exits from the county. It would have worked, except that this latest attack occurred outside their jurisdiction in Santa Cruz County. The trailside killer was on the move.
He took great delight in watching what the police agencies were trying to do, and that he was staying always one step ahead of us, one step ahead of apprehension, and was probably taking great glee into the fact that he was not being identified, not being discovered. And I'm sure that he was reading every news article that came out.
Santa Cruz police found some footprints at the scene and took plaster casts for future comparison. Those and the bullets were almost all the evidence authorities had. But there was one thing the killer didn't count on. Stephen Hartle had survived the shooting. He was an eyewitness. But when police showed him the sketch of the trailside killer, something was horribly wrong. Hartle didn't recognize him. In fact, he was certain his shooter was another man. Authorities now faced the shocking possibility that Hartle and his girlfriend were victims of a copycat. The man Hartle described looked nothing like the killer in Marin County. He was large with broad shoulders. He wore glasses, a mustache, and had thinning hair. And most unlike the trailside killer, this man was 20 or 25 years older. Detectives swiftly distributed the second sketch around the area and redoubled their efforts to catch not one, but two killers.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Then, a call came in to Detective Keaton that set the record straight. The lab had compared the bullets from the Santa Cruz attack to the ones in Marin County. They were a perfect match. The bullets had been fired from the same gun. There was no younger man. The first suspect composite had been a terrible, time-consuming mistake. Authorities had been looking for the wrong man. They quickly dispensed with the first sketch and concentrated on the eyewitness account.
So instead of it being a young white male in his early to mid-20s, we were looking at a male who was actually about 50 years of age.
Hey, hon.
While the hunt continued, people went about their daily lives. Heather Skaggs needed a car. She'd shopped around for a few months with her boyfriend, but had no luck.
It's David Carpenter.
She decided to check out a car that one of her co-workers had found for sale.
Yeah, I've got a number in my purse, because I do need to get going down here.
Before she went off, she jotted her co-worker's phone number. His name was David Carpenter.
Yeah, but listen, I'll just talk to you.
Heather was running a little late and had to rush if she was going to meet Carpenter on time. They said their goodbyes, and then Heather left for the last time. In the morning, when she hadn't come home, her boyfriend turned to David Carpenter for answers.
Okay.
Carpenter hadn't seen Heather or heard from her at all that day. Concerned, her boyfriend went to the police. When police questioned Carpenter, he told them the same story. But his resemblance to the sketch of the trailside killer was difficult to overlook. For 2 weeks, they kept him under surveillance. When a background check revealed that he'd previously been convicted for rape and assault, investigators brought him in. Although the murder weapon was nowhere to be found, investigators retrieved a single .38 caliber bullet from his car. It was rushed to the lab for analysis. Heather Skaggs' body was found a few days later.
You can't see through the glass. Okay.
Stephen Hartle had recovered fully from the attack and was brought in to look at a lineup. He had no trouble picking out the man who had shot him and killed his girlfriend. There was no doubt in his mind that David Carpenter was that man.
Yeah, Richard. Good afternoon.
At long last, authorities believed they had captured the trailside killer. Finally, the parks were safe. The senseless murders would stop. But to make the case, officers still needed to find the murder weapon. Then, police received word from a man in prison who had known Carpenter. He had information to share in exchange for a lighter sentence. He told police that if they searched a certain vacant lot in San Francisco, they'd find Carpenter's gun buried under some rubble. The weapon was sent back to Mike Waller at the lab for final testing and identification.
We got knives, we got guns.
By test firing the gun himself, Waller had bullets to compare with those collected from the murder sites.
Fire in the hole!
When the two were put together, they matched perfectly. Without question, both bullets were fired from the same gun. Police had in their possession the weapon that had killed 7 people. In addition to the ballistics evidence, blood and saliva samples taken from Carpenter matched the biological evidence taken at the first crime scene. And Carpenter had recently purchased a pair of shoes with treads that were consistent with the casts taken from the trails. David Carpenter had little trouble finding and capturing his victims. From a mountain vantage point, he could oversee the trails and make out lone hikers. Knowing exactly where they were headed, he could easily ambush his prey. In execution style, Carpenter shot his victims in the back of the head. David Carpenter was convicted of a total of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of rape. He was given 2 death sentences. Carpenter specifically targeted women for his sexual gratification. Male victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though most serial killers are men, they don't always prey on the opposite sex. In the spring of 1983, a young man was discovered dead in a field off Interstate 294 in Lake County, Illinois, just outside Chicago. He had been bound, tortured, undressed, and stabbed multiple times. It appeared to be an isolated incident. But within a few weeks, another body turned up just off the interstate, less than a mile from the first, and in eerily similar condition. In both cases, detectives could find little at the crime scenes to lead them to the killer. 4 months later, a third victim, Ralph Calise, was found murdered in the same manner along the same stretch of highway where the first 2 victims were found. The press gave the murderer a name, the Interstate Killer. It was at the Calise site that authorities gathered what they hoped would be their first fruitful clues. Most important were footprints and tire tracks. Although not necessarily connected to the murder, it was the first time any type of prints had been recovered. Investigators made plaster casts in case a suspect emerged. Detective Dan Collin knew it would only be a matter of time before he killed again.
When we had the third victim in August, which was Ralph Calise, then we knew we had obviously an individual working the north side of Chicago. If you're still alive over there.
Aware that serial killers often move around to avoid capture, Collin notified neighboring jurisdictions. When Lake County police described their victims, authorities in Indiana recognized the pattern all too well. They had been investigating 9 of their own unsolved murders that fit the killer's profile. All the victims had been stabbed in similar fashion and abandoned near highways. The manhunt took on new urgency now that police knew the killer had crisscrossed state lines to murder 12 men.
Which town? It's actually right off the map.
In their pursuit of the interstate killer, Indiana and Illinois law enforcement pooled their resources. Acting on a tip, Indianapolis police had singled out one suspect, a man named Larry Eiler, who had been arrested for a similar crime and acquitted. Even as Indiana's #1 suspect, there was no hard evidence against him. Authorities couldn't make a move until he moved first. But when and if he did, they were ready for him. Illinois police had the plaster casts of the footprints and tires taken from their last crime scene. If Indiana authorities could find a way to compare the prints with Eiler's, they were welcome to them. In less than a month, they'd have their chance. On September 30th, 1983, an Indiana state trooper stopped to question 2 men in a truck parked on the side of a road near Interstate 65. The driver explained that they had just stopped for a bathroom break, but the patrolman ran a routine check anyway. He called in the driver's name. It was Larry Eiler.
So what happened was when the state trooper ran his name, one of the dispatchers recognized the name, and from there contacted a detective sergeant with the Indiana State Police, who then said arrest Larry and bring him into custody and bring him to Lowell Station for questioning.
Among the things found in Eiler's truck were a pair of boots, a knife, and a bag of rope. It looked like police had found the interstate killer just in time.
Open the door, please.
Eiler was hauled into custody and subjected to a day of intense interrogation. He remained calm and denied having any knowledge of the murders. But while he was being questioned, investigators were busy gathering evidence from the items seized during the arrest. At the crime lab, examiners processed the evidence that had been confiscated. The tires had been taken off of Larry Eiler's pickup truck and were rolled and printed with the hopes of matching the tread to the plaster casts made at one of the interstate killer's crime scenes. Within days, investigators were confident of their findings. It was the news police had expected. The tire tracks matched perfectly, as did the boot prints. Larry Eiler had been at the scene, and now they had the evidence to prove it in court. But the prints only linked Eiler to the area where the body was found. It didn't prove he had killed Ralph Calise. That information was hidden within other items seized from Larry Eiler at his arrest. The soles of Eiler's boots were caked with dried blood. It matched the blood of Ralph Calise. A knife found in the truck also showed minuscule traces of his blood. With such conclusive evidence, investigators were sure they had their man. They charged Larry Eiler with the murder of Ralph Calise and set about preparing for the trial. It looked like the end of the interstate killer. It wasn't. All the evidence amounted to nothing.
Evidence was thrown out because of what's known as the exclusionary rule, the fruit of the poisonous tree. You can't illegally seize evidence and then use it against somebody.
Apparently, the sergeant answering the officer's call mistook the routine surveillance alert out on Eiler for a detention order. He had been arrested unjustly. Even in the face of indisputable forensic evidence, nothing could stick unless the proper procedures had been followed. The bloody knife, the boots, and the tire track were ruled inadmissible. Eiler was released. Police would have to start over. Eiler was guilty and he was free. All that authorities could do was helplessly watch and wait until he tried to kill again. The Illinois police attempted to maintain surveillance on Larry Eiler, not only to prevent another murder, but also hoping that he would slip up and leave behind some evidence they could use. But constant surveillance was impossible.
People can say that, well, why didn't the police watch him? There's no way that we can put, men around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week watching somebody. It's almost impossible to do. While people are going around their normal, everyday life. We couldn't do it. So it was a matter of when was Larry going to kill again? And Danny Bridges was our answer.
In August of 1984, a janitor at a Chicago apartment building watched a man from a neighboring building dump some garbage bags into the wrong dumpster. This had happened too many times before, and the janitor took it upon himself to remove the bags from his building's trash receptacle. But as he lifted the bag, it tore, exposing the horror within. A human leg protruded through the plastic. When police responded, they recognized the address of Eiler's apartment building right next door. The trash bags contained the dismembered body of a young man identified as Danny Bridges. Even though this was not the interstate killer's style, authorities were certain the bags would eventually lead back to Eiler. The trash bags were sent to the forensics lab at the Chicago Police Department. Forensic investigator James Doran was in charge of the examination.
We paid particular attention to the plastic bags in which the dismembered body parts were in. And the reason for that is we felt if we could develop any type of impression or a latent fingerprint on here, we could tie this up to a suspect.
The bags were fumed to bring out any prints. Doran discovered several perfect sets. To no one's surprise, they belonged to Larry Eiler. Investigators had him once again, right where they wanted him. This time they were meticulous. The evidence was unquestionable. All procedures had been followed.
Yeah, well, I think the one that
Eiler's
found in the
interstate
bag,
reign of terror was
bag
over.
on the inside, I think that's
Or
a
so
real
they
good
thought.
All right. Bye.
When Eiler was questioned, he explained that he'd thrown some things in the dumpster and had to move a few bags to make room. Apparently, he said, he must have moved the body bags. Authorities knew he was lying, but the truth was, anyone could have touched those bags once they were in the dumpster. His simple alibi was airtight. Once again, it looked like the interstate killer was going to walk away scot-free. Hoping to bag a killer, the trash bags that contained the body parts were fumed for fingerprints again, this time on the inside. There, in one of the bags, forensic expert James Doran found a single print left by Larry Eiler.
I mean, there are no two people in this world with the same fingerprints to date. And unless Larry Eiler could explain away why he had his thumbprint, fingerprint, on the inside of that bag containing a part of Danny Bridges, we had the person who killed Danny Bridges.
Armed with a single fingerprint, police arrested Eiler at his apartment and charged him with the murder of Danny Bridges. Once more, authorities had Eiler in custody, but this time they were going to make sure that he wasn't released. Every inch of the apartment would need to be examined in order to build a foolproof case to take to court. Initially, investigators found the apartment virtually spotless. But as they began to probe, they uncovered pieces of a puzzle that told of a grisly murder. The story of Danny Bridges' death was found in bits of evidence collected throughout the apartment. An awl discovered in the bedroom was found to have small traces of human blood on it. Although the samples were too minute to match to the victim, investigators felt it was probably the weapon that caused the punctures found in his body. The frame of a hacksaw that detectives believe was used to cut up the body was also found to contain traces of human blood. But again, it wasn't enough blood to link to Danny Bridges. For such a violent crime to have occurred in such a confined space, authorities were surprised to find the apartment so clean. Detectives supposed that if the body was dismembered in the apartment, the killer would have done it in the bathroom. They took up the threshold, hoping to find some blood that Eiler wouldn't have thought to clean up. Their hunch was right. Underneath the bathroom threshold was enough dried blood to be tested. It was sent to the lab. To get a clearer picture of how the murder transpired, investigators switched off the lights. Luminol is a chemical that glows on contact with even the faintest traces of blood. When detectives sprayed the mixture, the truth shone through. The brutality of the crime left its stains throughout the apartment. Microanalyst Marion Caporuso was responsible for extracting trace evidence at the scene.
When we were doing the luminol processing, although we knew that there was blood at the area, there were none of us that were really prepared for the scope of the amount of blood that was present, the pattern of the wipes. I think there was an audible sigh as we realized that the luminol processing gave us such insight into how the crime scene was actually cleaned up.
The blood samples were analyzed to determine if they matched Danny Bridges or if they were from some other unfortunate victim. At the time, DNA testing was not available.
The type of testing that could be done in the mid-1980s was genetic marker testing. I did an analysis in 6 genetic marker systems and determined that in fact the blood under the threshold did match the type of Danny Bridges. That particular combination of types occurred in 3% of the Caucasian population.
That level of precision, coupled with the other evidence, was enough to convict Larry Eiler of murdering Danny Bridges. He was sentenced to death. Eventually, he confessed to killing 22 others over 4 years. On August 21st, 1994, he picked up Danny Bridges outside a bar. But instead of driving to a remote outdoor area, this time Eiler took the young man home. After tying him up, Eiler stabbed and tortured his victim. He had to drag the body to the tub in order to cut it into pieces small enough to dispose of. Blood covered the apartment, and though he'd taken careful measures to clean up, the stains of his guilt were indelible. Even after a serial killer is caught, his motives remain elusive. Experts know only that these murderers are relentless in their drive to kill. Investigators are equally relentless in their mission to stop serial killers. Though the crimes are enormous, success often hinges on a series of tiny clues the killer leaves in his wake. Investigators on the scene of a drug overdose find themselves matching wits with a serial killer. Something in the water has killed an office worker in Arizona. Her colleagues are lucky to be alive. Now detectives must decipher a mass poisoner's chilling agenda. When a healthy woman is found dead in her bath, investigators know she didn't drown on her own. Chemistry confirms there's more here than meets the eye. But can it lead them to the killer? Our material world is built on just 113 kinds of atoms. Their combinations can produce a world of good, but in the wrong hands, they're just bad medicine. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, December 10th, 1994, Detroit police arrived at the hotel suite of Lowell and Roberta Amos, just 1 block from police headquarters. Lowell had reported that his wife had overdosed on cocaine and was dead. Police found a cocaine straw and playing card in the nightstand, but no signs of the drug. Mr. Amos said he panicked and flushed it when he woke to discover that his wife was dead. To police, it seemed that Amos had done more than dispose of the cocaine. The room was neat as a pin, practically scrubbed clean. The bedding where the victim lay, however, was thoroughly soiled and smeared from side to side.
So how much more you got to work on there?
Though the victim wore no makeup, the pillowcase was saturated with cosmetics. When the medical examiner removed the victim, it was clear that she had been dead several hours before police were notified. Suspicions arose that there was more here than Amos was telling. Homicide was called in, and Lowell Edward Amos gave police his account of what happened that night.
I got it.
Roberta Amos was last seen with her husband in the hotel suite of his business partner, Norbert Crabtree, and his girlfriend, Darcy Smith.
Fine, thank you.
The event was the company Christmas party, and executives were given suites at the hotel so they wouldn't have to drive afterward. Though Lowell and Roberta Amos were unofficially separated, she agreed to accompany him to the party. Afterward, Crabtree had invited Lowell and Roberta to his suite to continue celebrating. They stayed until 4:30 a.m. Lowell told police that after they returned to their suite, they made love and started doing cocaine. Lowell fell asleep, while Roberta continued using the drug. He said that she had sinus trouble and couldn't snort it, so she found other ways to get it into her system. She must have overdosed while he slept. Because drugs were involved, he was afraid to call the police right away and flushed the remainder. But that didn't adequately explain why he waited so long to call authorities. Swabs taken from the victim's vaginal area tested positive for traces of cocaine. Other than that, there were no other external signs of the drug. That was strange. Internally, she had 14 times more cocaine than is normally seen in an overdose. She died before half of it was broken down. In cocaine poisoning, death is preceded by violent convulsions. Forensic chemist Phyllis Good believed that Amos could not have shared the victim's bed and slept through that. In fact, he probably couldn't have fallen asleep at all.
Well, cocaine is a central nervous system stimulant and has the effect of keeping a person awake and full of energy. It's not the usual case that a person would go to sleep right after they've used cocaine.
Get this sheet off of here, that should be the last thing we need.
Lowell Amos did his best to clean up the scene, but his story of his wife's death just wasn't washing. Now, investigators had to prove that he killed her. At the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, Phyllis Good examined the bedsheet to determine what caused the stains. Nothing in Lowell Amos's scenario could have accounted for their condition. Because the victim's body was so clean, they suspected that Lowell had washed it before he called police. Investigators hoped some evidence remained in the linens. The sheet was treated with chemicals to more clearly reveal the stains. Portions were cut out and labeled. Because the stains occurred on virtually all portions of the sheet, Good took samples from all areas. The same process was repeated with the pillowcase to see if anything besides makeup could be identified. The pattern of the smudges suggested that the pillow wasn't simply wiped across the victim's face.
What appeared to be lipstick, or characterized as lipstick, is that there is an imprint on the pillowcase of what had appeared to be imprint of teeth marks. And they are located in this area under the blue spot. The blue coloration is from laboratory testing.
People at the Christmas party told police that they had seen the victim wearing makeup. When her body was found, she had none, but the pillow revealed she went to bed wearing it. Apparently, she had bitten hard on the pillow, or the pillow had been pushed hard into her face before she died.
Now, once we do
A bruise on her nose suggested that it was pressed with tremendous force. The samples from the pillowcase and sheet were sent to the State Police Crime Lab for analysis. Investigators awaited the results. Meanwhile, police interviewed Norbert Crabtree and a business associate. He admitted that on the day of the death, Lowell Amos had phoned his room at 8:30 a.m. saying he needed help. He wasn't specific. Crabtree, who was awakened by the call, didn't arrive until 9:30 with another business associate. Lowell told them that Roberta was dead and gave them a bag to hold for him. Detective Patrick Hennahan was assigned to the case.
The items were described as a washcloth from the hotel linen that was stained and very foul smelling, a sport coat, and a syringe without a needle in a small leather type carrying case.
Amos collected the items from his friends later. Investigators never recovered them. To determine what happened, they had to rely on the evidence at hand, namely the bedsheet and pillowcase. The lab results showed traces of cocaine throughout the sheet, but that was all.
The results of the tests were the lack of urine or presence of urine, the lack of semen or seminal fluid, and the only thing that was identified in the brown areas was characterized as vegetative matter.
The identity of the brown stains was inconclusive. They shed no light on what happened, only deepening the mystery. The fact that the cocaine was also smeared around the sheet and tucked under the sides merely told investigators what they already knew, that Lowell Amos had manipulated the scene, either out of fear of being blamed for contributing to his wife's death, or to hide the evidence that proved he murdered her. As investigators mulled over which it could be, Lowell Amos's past began to catch up with him. It seemed that Amos may have been a real lady killer. As word spread of the investigation into the death of Roberta Amos, investigators in Detroit learned much about the suspect, Lowell Amos. He had an unsettling history with women. Two came forward who said that before he married Roberta, they met him at a bar, had drinks with him, and woke up in his apartment with no recollection of how they had gotten there. Other women reported becoming violently ill after being intimate with him. They claimed they'd been drugged. But the most astonishing revelations were yet to come.
I began to receive phone calls from relatives, received phone calls from doctors, private investigators, police officers, friends from as far away as Oregon. Most of the information that was coming in was in regards not just to Roberta Maury Amos, but also her husband Lowell Amos. I was advised that this was not his first wife to die at a young age under suspicious circumstances.
None of the deaths were considered criminal at the time, but times had changed, and the death of Roberta Amos shed new light on old events. In 1994, Michigan amended its rules of evidence. Past incidents could now be entered into a current criminal trial. If Amos's dark history could be shown to have some bearing on Roberta's death, the case against him would be the first one tried under the new rules. Nancy Westveld, assistant prosecuting attorney for Wayne County, Michigan, was brought in to see if the rules applied to Lowell Edward Amos.
If somehow we could demonstrate what Mr. Amos's real intentions were by looking back and looking at these other women, looking at their lives, looking at their deaths, looking at how Ed Amos had treated them, and in the end, what he did to them as they died.
The first Mrs. Amos, Sandra Amos, died in 1979 at age 36. The couple had been married 9 years. According to Lowell, Sandra mixed Dalmane, a sedative, with wine and must have collapsed and hit her head on the bathroom counter. Though Sandra's autopsy revealed traces of Dalmane and alcohol in her system, it wasn't enough to incapacitate her. Most of the drug was still in her stomach, undigested. She showed only a small abrasion over her eye, not enough to knock her out or kill her. Her cause of death was undetermined. The circumstances were not suspicious enough to launch an investigation. However, in hindsight, one detail stood out. After Sandra was taken away, a neighbor walked in to find Amos burning something in the fireplace. He told the neighbor it was his wife's clothes, bloodied from her accident. But whatever killed Sandra left no bleeding cuts or lacerations. There was no blood at the scene, and she was taken away in the clothes she was wearing when she died.
So the question became for us, what was Ed burning in the fireplace? And why was it so important that he get it destroyed before anyone saw exactly what it was?
Lowell Edward Amos received $350,000 as beneficiary of his first wife's insurance. Shortly after came wife number 2, Carolyn Amos, Lowell's mistress while he was married to Sandra.
You are irresponsible, no.
Their marriage was rocky. The friction point was the huge insurance policies Lowell kept taking out on his new wife. When he would not drop these policies in 1988, Carolyn threw him out of the house. He went to live with his mother, Mary Tolles, age 76. He stayed with her approximately 2 weeks when she became ill and was brought to the emergency room. Her doctor commented that it appeared as though she was drugged, but none of the medications prescribed to her could account for her disorientation. At the hospital, she began to recover and was sent home. Carolyn Amos phoned Mary Tolles every day to check up on her. A few weeks after Tolles returned from the hospital, Carolyn's call was answered by Lowell, who had just discovered that his mother was dead, apparently for several hours. Carolyn raced over to the house with a friend to find Lowell packing his belongings into his car. He didn't want anyone to know he was living there. Lowell inherited more than $1 million from his mother's estate. No autopsy was performed on Mary Tolles because of her age. Carolyn let Lowell move back into the house. 9 months later, in the spring of 1989, Carolyn, too, was dead. According to Lowell's report to police, he brought Carolyn a glass of wine while she was in the bathroom blow-drying her hair. When he went to check on her later, he found her dead on the bathroom floor, eerily like his first wife. It took a while for medical assistants to arrive at their secluded house. By then, it was too late to revive her. Amos suggested that she may have been electrocuted from the blow dryer. An examination of the cord showed that it had been cut, but Carolyn wasn't electrocuted. Her cause of death was never determined. Though the case was never pursued, the medical crew found inconsistencies at the scene. The wine glass was missing, found later rinsed and in the dishwasher, and the position of the victim's body suggested that she had been moved.
Her pajama top and her pajama pants were up at the ends, both at the bottoms of her feet as well as at her waist, hitched up, as it were, as if she had been moved. Certainly not in a position they would have been if she had crumpled to the floor.
Lowell received $800,000 from his second wife's insurance policies. For investigators, Lowell Amos was the kiss of death to the women he purportedly loved. Detective Hennehan believed it had to be more than coincidence.
I have had 3 close relatives of mine that have died. I've never been within 500 miles of any one of them when they died. Lowell Amos was in the company of all 4 of these persons when they died. He benefited emotionally and financially from their deaths.
Like the other deaths, Roberta Amos lay dead for some time before authorities were notified.
Ed wanted to make sure that each of these women was beyond help. He wanted to make sure none could be resuscitated, none could be medically brought back to life, because he wanted all of these women dead.
Though Roberta Amos's marriage was failing, she enjoyed a measure of professional success. Shortly before her death, she had purchased a house with her own money. Her plan was to legally end her marriage to Lowell and make a fresh start. Though Lowell Edward Amos had no financial stake in her death, investigators believed that he couldn't stand the idea that she had rejected him. The similarities between the death of Roberta Amos and Lowell's other wives was enough to expose him as an opportunistic serial killer who murdered for money or just to end an inconvenient marriage. Based on the collected evidence and the ghosts from his past, authorities had what they needed to arrest him for the murder of his third wife, Roberta Amos.
From the photographs of that night, Roberta Maury Amos looked happy. She looked like she was having a good time. She must have had hope for the future then. she shouldn't have.
At trial, the prosecution presented an account of the last night of Roberta Amos's life. After leaving Norbert Crabtree's suite, the couple went to their own room, where Lowell dissolved a large quantity of cocaine in water. He was somehow able to incapacitate the victim. Once she was subdued, he used a syringe to administer the lethal dose of cocaine. Then, perhaps as she was convulsing, he smothered her with the pillow. He then scrubbed the body and cleaned up the crime scene as best he could before calling Crabtree to dispose of the remaining evidence. For his crime, Lowell Edward Amos was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lowell Amos escaped suspicion through the subtlety of his crimes. But his past and forensics caught up with him at last. Other killers are more obvious in their methods, though they may be just as difficult to catch. Monday, March 24th, 1986, started out like any other Monday. By 8:30 a.m., the employees at the Transamerica Title Insurance Company in Tempe, Arizona, were already at the office. Their weekends a fading memory. Like her co-workers, 46-year-old Julie Ann Williams eased into the day with a trip to the break room. The coffee was on, but she preferred a drink of cool water. Just one sip told her something wasn't right.
Should I come with you?
She immediately didn't feel well and headed to the ladies' room. She didn't know it, but she was beyond help. When Julie Williams was found in the ladies' room shortly before 9 a.m., she was in cardiac arrest. By the time paramedics arrived, she had slipped into a coma. They rushed her to the hospital. Something was in the water. While the co-workers discussed what had happened, one of them, Diane Harry, was on the phone to her husband. She was more concerned than the rest because something similar happened to her just a few days before. By the time police arrived to investigate, Diane Harry's husband, Lewis Harry, was already there, looking for what might have poisoned the water.
You take care, okay?
But it wasn't just the cooler that was tainted. Tempe Police Sergeant Mike Palmer led the investigation.
I detected an odor within the room. Upon examining almost every cup or container of any type and the coffee pot that was in there, I could see that there was some type of substance in almost all of them. At that point, we decided that someone had purposely placed whatever this material was in these containers in order to injure people.
The office workers were lucky that no one else was hurt. But Julie Williams, after lingering in a coma, was not so fortunate. Whoever spread poison in the break room was now a murderer. Samples of the unknown poison were taken for identification. Police dusted for fingerprints, but no suspicious ones turned up.
We're only going to have it for a short while, so if you wouldn't mind turning
The police interviewed the office workers. Diane Harry told detectives that on the previous Friday, she became ill after taking a sip of scotch at home. That Saturday, a cup of tea affected her the same way.
She remained ill the entire weekend. She barely could get out of bed. And she told me that the smell of the substance that she had inside her house in Phoenix was pretty much the same as the smell that was in the substance that was in the break room.
Questions as far as what happened with her.
She was concerned that she was the poisoner's target, which is why she called her husband to the office when Julianne Williams became ill.
I'm sorry. Sir?
Police talked to Louis Harry. He too was worried that someone was trying to poison Diane Harry. He said he'd been receiving threatening letters from the abusive boyfriend of a woman he'd helped. Perhaps this was his revenge. Louis was sent home to collect the letters, along with the scotch bottle and tea kettle, so they could be analyzed.
We'll certainly let you know.
Meantime, police collected the security cards that every employee needed to enter the building. Investigators suspected that whoever planted the poison did it sometime during the weekend. A check with the security company showed that only one security card had been used that weekend, at 10:18 on Saturday morning. It belonged to Diane Harry.
When I confronted Mrs. Harry about her card being the only one used during the weekend, she denied having used it. The only thing she could tell me was that she did not know where it was at, other than the fact it should have been in her purse, because that's where she'd placed it the last time she'd used it.
Ms. Harry, I just have a couple of questions.
The card was in fact in her purse Monday morning when she went to work. She insisted she'd been bedridden all weekend and never left the house.
It says that you checked into your office.
So far, all the evidence pointed to Diane Harry. But was she the prime suspect or the intended victim? It was too soon to tell. While detectives were trying to identify the criminal, scientists were trying to name their poison. Samples from the office water cooler, coffee creamer, and sugar bowl, along with the tea kettle and scotch bottle from the Harry's house, were brought to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, where they were analyzed by Supervisor Jim Timmons. He knew that the poison was a fast-acting white powder. That helped him narrow down his tests.
I really came up with a pretty short list of poisons that could have resulted in the information that I had heard about the case. And the short list was arsenic, strychnine, or cyanide.
Investigators applied a series of tests to the compound to narrow the list even further and to check and double-check his results. An ultraviolet light was shown through a solution of the unknown substance and measured on an apparatus called a spectrophotometer. Strychnine, which absorbs UV light, would give a reading. Arsenic and cyanide, which reflect UV, wouldn't register. The unknown substance gave a reading on the spectrophotometer, proving it wasn't strychnine. They then performed a test for arsenic. Samples of the substance were dissolved in acid, and a copper wire was placed in the resulting solution. If arsenic were present, it would attach to the wire and turn it black. No arsenic was present. The unknown poison in the office and in the Harry's home was most likely cyanide. To be certain, Timmons used a commercial kit for identifying cyanide.
It's actually a very simple test, but it involves some pretty complex chemical reactions. Ultimately, what happens is a red dye is formed if you have cyanide, and you test this on a paper strip that you drop into a solution. And in this case, it was positive, indicating cyanide was present.
To remove all shadow of doubt, Timmons further confirmed his results with a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. The substance was sealed in a test tube of acid. If it was truly cyanide, it would form hydrogen cyanide gas, like a mini gas chamber. The gas was drawn off and injected into the apparatus, which confirmed that the cyanide gas was created. The battery of tests would provide essential forensic evidence for the courtroom if the poisoner was ever brought to trial. Timmons was not done yet. Cyanide most commonly appears in two forms, sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide. Both are equally lethal. A technique called energy dispersive X-ray analysis allowed him to simultaneously check for various elements in the compound. He found potassium. Samples from the office and from the Harry's home gave identical results. Both were potassium cyanide. The water cooler alone had enough cyanide to kill 150 people. The killer had set his or her traps in both places and cast a wide net to catch one victim. Diane Harry was either lucky to be alive or trying to disguise her role as the poisoner. The questioning continued.
I questioned Miss Harry about her husband's ability to get her electronic card that allowed access to the building, and she stated that he could have, but as far as she knew, it was in her purse. She indicated to me that she was not sure where he had been on that Saturday morning from approximately 9 in the morning until 12:30.
If Diane truly didn't use her security card on Saturday, perhaps her husband did. He was the only other person who would have had access to it. He said he was running errands that day. He couldn't account for his exact whereabouts at the time the card was used to enter the building. He insisted that the killer was the jealous boyfriend of the woman whom he had helped. He had the threatening letters to prove it. While the documents were being examined, investigators looked further into Louis Harry's movements. Their quest took them to a convenience store across the street from his wife's office building.
We were able to find an individual who actually observed a black male subject driving a blue sports car, which is what Mr. Harry drove, enter at the approximate time that his wife, Diane Harry's key card was used to open the door to the business.
That gave investigators the leverage they needed to serve a search warrant on Louis Harry's office. He worked in the athletics department of a community college. In the wastebasket, detectives found a label from a chemical supplier, some white powder on a bookshelf, and a small plastic knife, also speckled with powder that was later identified as cyanide. The cyanide found in his office didn't prove he put it there. A defense lawyer could argue that whoever tried to poison his wife also left cyanide at Louis's office. But the next discovery would be much more difficult to explain away.
Also, there was a legal pad that we found that had the handwritten version of the threatening letters that had been mailed to him, the last few of the threatening letters.
The pad and a box of envelopes were brought to the Department of Public Safety, where they were analyzed by forensic document examiner Bill Flynn.
In many ways, handwriting is even more individualistic or individualizing than DNA for this reason. There are groups of people in society like monozygotal twins or identical twins who do in fact have identical DNA characteristics. However, in forensic handwriting identification, we've never found any two people that have exactly identical handwriting characteristics.
The handwriting on the letters was compared to samples of Louis Harry's writing taken from business forms at his office and at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Flynn was able to say that Harry had actually written the drafts of the two threatening letters he claimed were sent to him. After he perfected his wording longhand, he typed the letters and mailed them. An analysis of the envelopes proved it. The letters that Harry presented to police were sent in slightly defective envelopes. The unused envelopes in the box confiscated at Harry's office bore similar flaws. Flynn exploited that weakness to strengthen his case.
A defect of the type that we had seen in that envelope was actually rare. The reason it was rare is that it would be severe enough to shut down the line. They would actually have to clear the envelope-making line and restart it in order to clear that type of error.
For Lewis Harry, the defective envelopes were especially incriminating. But they didn't seal his fate. Forensics had proved only that he'd sent himself the threatening letters. Now it had to prove he'd carried out his poisoned promises. To tie Lewis Harry to the poisoning of his wife's office, detectives needed to prove that he'd purchased the cyanide. They went to the chemical company listed on the label found in his office and obtained their sales records. The clerk recalled selling potassium cyanide to an African-American male. On the receipt, the name was Charles Holly. An African-American man named Charles Holly was contacted. He told police he'd never purchased cyanide. His signature wasn't close to the one on the receipt. Lewis Harry was asked to give a handwriting sample.
We asked Lewis Harry to write the name Charles Holly. He did do that. And from the earlier writings that I had in my office, and now with the new exemplars, I was able to identify Lewis Harry as actually writing the name.
That was all detectives needed to make their case against Lewis Harry. According to the prosecution scenario, Lewis Harry did receive threatening letters from the ex-boyfriend of the woman who was secretly Harry's new lover. The letters gave Harry the idea to write his own, more threatening letters and send them to himself, implicating the ex-boyfriend. He practiced his poison pen letters before typing them. When his attempts to poison Diane Harry at home didn't work, he secretly borrowed her security card, sneaked into her office, and poisoned everything he could find in the break room. He was a frequent visitor to his wife's office, so his fingerprints weren't suspicious. But when his wife called him after Julianne Williams was poisoned, he wasted no time coming to the office to leave even more prints while pretending to show concern. Diane Harry's trust in her husband was steadfast to the end. Throughout the investigation, she refused to believe that he could be the poisoner. Though she remained unconvinced by the evidence, the jury saw it another way. For the murder of Julianne Williams, Lewis Harry was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, plus 105 more years for attempted murder. He's serving at least 95 years. Even after Lewis Harry's conviction, Diane Harry swore that he was a victim of circumstance. Her feelings changed a year later when her brother uncovered the box of cyanide hidden in the Harry's attic. For every criminal who thinks he's committed the perfect murder, there's a team of dedicated investigators out to prove him wrong. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the morning of March 28, 1990, 6-year-old James Woodward called his dad because he couldn't find his mother. The Woodwards had been separated for 3 months. David Woodward told his son to go to the neighbor for help. The boy told the neighbor that he thought his mother was locked in the bathroom, but he couldn't hear any sounds inside. she followed James to the bathroom.
He's in here. He's in here.
Go call 911, quick.
She jimmied the lock and found 30-year-old Deborah Woodward submerged in the tub. An odor like solvent hung in the air. The paramedics and deputy medical examiner arrived to study the scene. The victim showed no contusions or abrasions to suggest that she slipped in the tub.
Probably get a print of
There was
that.
nothing to indicate why she may have drowned. And there was no explaining the odor permeating the room. According to forensic pathologist Sparks Veazey, the situation was peculiar from the start.
A normal, healthy adult generally does not just drown in 4, 5, 6 inches of water in a bathtub. We look for some explanation for that.
At autopsy, blood was drawn and screened for alcohol, which might have contributed to the drowning. While a body is wet, injuries may be obscured, but as it dries, more is disclosed. As the examination continued, a chilling revelation sprang from the victim's own lips.
The examination of the inside of the lips showed injuries inside the lips, which were suggestive that something had been forcefully placed over the decedent's mouth and pressed into the teeth, causing injuries of the inside of the lips.
The case was looking more like homicide by the minute. The blood work showed no alcohol in the victim's system, but it did reveal a volatile substance similar to acetone, or nail polish remover. A sample of the blood was placed in a gas chromatograph to better identify the substance. It turned out to be ether. In fact, every tissue in the victim's body was saturated with it. Ether is a volatile liquid that can depress the central nervous system. Depending on how much is inhaled, it can cause dizziness, unconsciousness, or death by respiratory failure. It was once a common form of medical anesthesia, but was replaced by more predictable and safer methods. Ether can be produced in the body by the breakdown of some other chemicals or drugs the victim might have taken. Chief toxicologist Ronald Backer didn't believe this was the case.
But the fact that it was distributed in all tissues and in very high concentrations was a good indication that this was a significant substance that was not an artifact that really was involved in rendering her unconscious.
The victim had enough ether in her system to knock her out, but it was the drowning that did her in. This was no accident. While investigating the suspicious death of Deborah Woodward, police learned that she was separated from her husband, David. Even so, she shared her house with him until it could be sold. In an unconventional timeshare arrangement, their 3 sons stayed at the house while Deborah and David took turns living there and sharing child custody. The plan was designed to create some stability for the boys, but the friction between the couple lay just below the surface. Deborah had a restraining order preventing her husband from approaching the house while it was her turn to live there. None of the couple's problems escaped the scrutiny of Albuquerque police detective Damon Fay, who was investigating Deborah Woodward's murder.
Now I had to explore every part of her life, and I had to just open up all of the canisters of her life. One of them was her diary, particularly ghoulish to read because I could see the buildup of heading towards marriage with David, all of her excitement that goes along with that, the new marriage, the early years of it, then the deterioration of it.
In her diaries, which Deborah entrusted to a friend for safekeeping, she recounted the physical and emotional abuse that she endured.
Dave slapped me around in the bathroom, messed up my clothes, broke things. So much anger. Hell, absolute hell.
After the separation, Deborah tried to get on with her life. She began dating and was starting a serious relationship. But her husband was jealous, and she was fearful of what he might do. According to investigator Fay, she counted on her neighbor, a retired police sergeant, to keep an eye out for her, especially at night.
And had actually come to the rescue of Deborah on several occasions where she felt David had been skulking around, or she heard bumps in the night and wanted him to sort of investigate it. He would walk across the street and take care of things, walk around her house on occasion. So he had sort of passing knowledge about the domestic turbulence.
The neighbor told police that 6 months earlier, Deborah had noticed something odd in her car. He offered to take a look and discovered that David, an electronics expert at a garage, had planted a tape recorder in her car that switched on whenever the engine started. He'd also bugged the house and telephone lines.
There was nowhere in the house where she couldn't go that he could overhear whatever conversation was taking place. He could then take these tapes away and dissect them, go back through them, listen to them, and that would just infuriate him.
David was doing everything in his power to keep tabs on his wife, while Deborah devoted all her strength to making a clean break. It was a rough game of tug-of-war, and it looked like something had finally snapped. The neighbor told police that several days before the murder, he saw David Woodward dismantling the motion sensor spotlights he'd recently installed around the perimeter of the house. He thought nothing of it at the time. Now, it seemed too convenient. Woodward had the motive and opportunity to kill his wife. But where was the weapon? Though ether was obviously used to incapacitate the victim, it was the impurities in it that drew the focus of investigators. The killer had used impure industrial-grade ether, like the kind used in carburetor starting fluid. Considering that David worked in a garage, that seemed a likely source. If they could link him to a brand of starting fluid with the same contaminants in it, they'd be that much closer to closing the case. They tested every can they could find, with no matches.
Hey man, I was watching the show the other night.
As investigators were busy tracking down the ether, one of Woodward's co-workers contacted police.
Oh man, there's so many
He
ways.
told them that a year earlier,
never,
Woodward had
ever
talked
know.
about getting away with murder by using a volatile substance, like ether. Woodward claimed it would be untraceable. He was very detailed about it, but the co-worker wasn't paying close
It knocks
attention.
people out. And what you do is you spray it on like a rag and you put it over their face.
Based on this lead and the other circumstantial evidence gathered at this point, police obtained a warrant to search the garage.
How long did you stay there?
They confiscated an assortment of chemicals, including more cans of carburetor starting fluid.
We never did find any brand that was perfect, but we found some that were very close and ones that we could put a star next to as the possible source of the ether in the Deborah Woodward blood sample.
But in terms of evidence, it was enough. David Woodward was arrested. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the murder of Deborah Woodward. It was the victim's habit to take a late-night soak after putting the children to sleep. While she was getting ready for her bath, David used his key to enter the house. He had already dismantled the motion sensors so he could sneak into the yard under cover of darkness. Once in the house, he saturated a rag with starting fluid, overpowered his wife, and caused the marks seen at autopsy. As the victim lay unconscious, David pushed her head below the water. He thought the ether would evaporate, and with it would go all evidence of a crime.
The truth of the matter is that dead men tell plenty of tales if you have a competent team of forensic investigators, which include the police at the scene, the autopsy people taking the samples, and the laboratory that analyzes the samples.
David Woodward received life in prison for murder and an additional 9 years for aggravated burglary for entering the home and battering his wife. No poison is perfect. The clearest liquid or finest powder still leaves behind its residue. And though the victim may at first appear unmarked, science can reveal how death was dispensed and dispense justice to the poisoner.